So, welcome everybody. It is our 13th Deeper Inquiry, and these sessions have been created to dive deeper into topics that we think are important in the European and global activist ecosystem. And today we have two special guests. Sarah is also an old friend and collaborator, and really happy to do this together. And Max is a new friend and collaborator, and the two of them really work some wizardry together. And they're really focusing on something that they've both been working on for a very long time. Max wrote a book when he was about 8 years old on radical imaginations, and Sarah's been an amazing political content producer for many years and thinker, and interlocutor for many people. And I think it's an incredibly neglected issue, the psychology of social movements and also the psychology of political contexts. It seems to be, to me, a really, really major blind spot to a lot of movement building, that the emotional and behavioral worlds that we bring into political discourse and community organizing is something, it's full of levers that are unused, not tapped into adequately, and lead us into sometimes perilous and dangerous rabbit holes, impasses, or fragmentations. So we're going to go on a whirlwind tour of some of the obstacles to movement building and what we could do to address them. And I'm going to pass over to Sarah and Max to let us know a little bit about themselves, their work, and yeah, rock and roll.
Hi,
everyone.
Nice to see everyone here. Welcome and thanks so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to chatting with you more about breaking through ideology, cognitive dissonance, and hopelessness. My name's Max. Thanks for the introduction, Haiven, and Sarah is here as well, obviously. In the sort of first half of this presentation, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Sarah and I do together at the Sense and Solidarity Initiative and why we do it. And then in the second half of the presentation today, Sarah's going to give you a kind of taste of the sorts of things that we do, particularly around the question of like, what do activists and organizers need to know about the concept of cognitive dissonance? And how can we confront it? How can we ameliorate it? How can we deal with it in interesting and informative ways? As Ivan mentioned, Sarah and I have started working together basically over the last year and a bit on an initiative that kind of brings together the things that each of us has been working for a while. So Sarah, as she'll tell you in a few minutes, has just finished a PhD on concepts of ideology and false consciousness, why essentially people believe things that are against their material interests. Essentially what's the way I like to frame it is basically what like the left has to learn from some of the latest social science and cognitive science about the way that people's minds work, what works to change minds, what doesn't work, and how we should going about it. Sarah has a book coming out next year from a major publisher called Don't Talk About Politics and What to Do Instead, which, as the title promises, will give us like a lot of very useful tools for thinking beyond the idea that in order to make social change, we should just go out and like talk to people in the marketplace of ideas and convince them of the righteousness of our way of thinking. Of course, there's lots of room for that. And we do need to learn those skills better and learn what kind of rhetorical techniques work. But as you'll hear in the latter part of this conversation today, a lot of the way that we have become habituated to think about how we go out and talk to people is actually based on very outdated ideas that are not serving our movements particularly well. But I'll let Sarah talk a little bit more about that in the second half of the presentation today. That is what she's bringing to our collaboration in the Sense and Solidarity Initiative. I'm bringing about 15 years of research into radical social movements under the banner of the radical imagination. And for me and my colleague Alex Kasnabish, we wrote a book about a little more than 10 years ago called The Radical Imagination. We frame that as a kind of concept that helps us understand how visions of another world don't come before activism. We tend to imagine that if only people could imagine that change would be possible, if only they could imagine another world they want to strive to create, then people would join our movements and struggle to create that world. But our research, which involved doing like these extensive interviews with dozens and dozens of radical activists, in Canada mostly, but elsewhere as well, indicated that in fact it's the opposite way around most of the time. People come to movements to say no to their existing reality, to refuse the systems of power that ingrid their lives. And through saying no together, new yeses emerge. And what we sort of looked at in that project is how can we sort of work with social movements to cultivate those spaces where people come together to refuse to fight back against power and to learn from one another about how to grow and build and expand and snowball outwards. So we've sort of brought these two things together since meeting and starting to work together a couple of years ago in a number of different forms. We do a series of workshops, which I'll tell you about in a second. We also organize writing retreats together. And we also are working on a podcast, which should be released later this summer or early in the fall. But before I tell you a little bit more about those, I just want to kind of zero in on why. And I hope some of these reasons why will resonate with you as well. One of them is that over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been massive advances in the cognitive sciences, by which we mean like psychology, social psychology, to a certain extent, neuroscience, to a certain extent, sort of behavioral economics, all sorts of fields of academic study that study how brains work and specifically how social brains work. But unfortunately, that research is largely being monopolized and used, and to be honest, weaponized by the revanchist center and the far right, in the sense that this knowledge is being used by tech companies and corporations in order to manipulate or nudge people into behaviors that increase consumerism, compliance with the status quo, and generally things that are going to make people into better workers and consumers. And to date, the left has not been particularly good at keeping up with this research. Now, as Sarah will talk about a little bit in the second half of this presentation, we should be very distrustful of this research. There's a lot of it that is undertaken in a highly individualist frame that assumes that individuals are what moves history and that basically we should repair people so that they can continue to take part in the ecologically and socially destructive system of capitalism. Nonetheless, there's a lot that we can learn from this latest science. And we at Sense and Solidarity want to be a bridge through which we can bring together movements to look at this research and think more critically about how we might incorporate it into our activities and our tactics and our strategies. The second thing that really motivates us, because both Sarah and I have PhDs, Sarah's a public intellectual who works outside of the university, I'm a university professor, is that for a generation at least, the left has largely relied upon universities as sort of spaces to do intellectual work, to be able to do critical thought. There's lots of courses that are forming now on social movement inquiry. I teach in one of them at Lakehead University in a social justice department. Many of the people whose work that we read are based in universities, but I think we need to be honest that that era is, if it hasn't come to an end, is coming to an end very, very quickly. Universities are under attack from the far right. They're being defunded by neoliberal austerity regimes. And in any case, a huge number of people who are going through universities are not getting jobs on the other side. So if at one point we did rely upon the university as an infrastructure for the radical left, we can certainly no longer rely on that. And we need to start building other institutions to relay knowledge and also to support people who are doing imaginative and intellectual work in our communities. Third, we as the people who are likely gathered in this room remain caught between knowing the limits of both verticalist and horizontalist forms of organizing, but not necessarily having a clear set of solutions or pathways forward at a moment when we need them the most. in the sense that many of us came of age, I certainly did in the alter globalization movement and later in the Occupy movements, in horizontal, anarchist and autonomist and feminist forms of organizing that tried to move away from models of leadership, or at least models of hierarchical and formal leadership, towards more informalized and horizontal methods of organizing. But we are certainly seeing the limits of that in the kind of horrific situation we find ourselves in. At the same time, most of us have also grown up with quite a hearty and I would say quite correct distrust of vertical, hierarchical, more rigid sorts of political organizations. But we are all struggling, I think almost everywhere in the world, to find a new balance between those that might be able to actualize our dreams and actually allow us to organize in a way that presents a meaningful threat to the powers that be. And finally, one of the things that animates us at Sense and Solidarity is the sense that we need to be much more intentional about cultivating a new generation of public intellectuals who have the skills to be able to communicate with the public widely and popularize radical ideas. We've watched over the last 50 years as the neoliberal revolution has rolled across the world and left it devastated. We are now in the process of watching as a far-right fascist reactionary thought collective is rolling across the world in the ruins of neoliberalism. And we have to this date not really been particularly strategic, those of us who are want a world of collective liberation, about how we cultivate our public intellectuals. So we're interested in all of these sorts of problems. To do that, we are doing a number of different things. One of them is we're organizing workshops, most of them in person, but also online. In the autumn of last year, we organized a 10-week online course on changing hearts and minds, which was a set of readings that people would do each week, and then discussions. In Berlin, I know a number of people who've joined the call. We're at our intensive 4-day workshop around May Day, where we, again, had a curriculum of stuff that people read and a series of discussions that was really, really fruitful with activists from a whole range of different struggles and a number of different geographies around the world. And we'll be doing another one coming up, which I'll show you a slide of in a minute, in London in November. That's a 3.5-day training. Again, bringing in all of the research that Sarah and I are doing about social movements and cognitive sciences, and seeing how we can make them relevant to people's struggles, and also offering a space for people from different struggles to meet and compare notes and strategize as well. We're also organizing a platform for writing. So we've been organizing a series of writing retreats nowadays about twice a year, where we're bringing together people who are working towards the idea of being radical left public intellectuals and comparing notes, trying to support each other in the very lonely, depressing process of writing, but also really talking about what it means to be a public intellectual in an age of ubiquitous social media, in an age where people's reading practices are changing dramatically, and in an age where it's very difficult to see the link sometimes between the process of thinking and thinking out loud and social movement activity. And again, to build infrastructures of mutual aid among people and between people who are trying to do this work in a context where some of the institutional supports, like the publishing industry and the university system as we know it, are crumbling. And then we just finished an intensive 4 days of recording, and we'll do another few this summer, of a podcast that we crowdfunded for this fall called What Do We Want? It is a show where we deal with the kind of dark underbelly of what brings our movements together and drives them apart. We have episodes now on heartbreak, on conspiracy, on pleasure, on despair, on shame, and on fantasy. That should round out the first season, but we are hoping to do a second season as well, where based on our interviews and conversations with activists and also the people who are coming to our workshops and with folks like you in forums like this, we sort of cultivate what's sticky and hard about that strange material we're trying to make a new world out of, which is to say one another, which is to say people. And we try and cull from the most interesting research that we can find about what might help us think through these problems and questions with greater depth and compassion and sophistication towards real tactics and strategies we can apply.
And also, we're just a bit silly. I think that's
We're
a good
also
thing.
very silly.
Like,
And
our first episode uses all of this very serious social science research, but it does make the point that basically joining a social movement is like getting into a relationship, and a lot of it has to do with breakups. So, yeah.
yeah. So it's also a fun, chatty, conversational podcast as well. I think, but maybe we're incredibly boring and awful. Tell us. Leave it in the comments. Don't leave it in the comments. I think we are sort of motivated by the fact that the question of ideology and the question of organization are two of the biggest problems that movements are facing today. We know the power of the institutions and structures that are arrayed against us, but the big problems that we are focusing on in Sense and Solidarity is, in the first case, why is it that people believe that change is impossible? Why is it that people seem to identify with the structures and the individuals within the system rather than with movements for liberation? How is it that we can break through the ideological traps that people find each other in? And second of all, how can our movements be better organized, especially in a time when we are called to move beyond simply responding to the crises, but actually starting to build the structures and systems we need to fight for a better world, but also to create that better world. This comes in a context where, as Sarah is going to explain in a minute here, debate as we understand it no longer works. If it ever did work, it no longer works as a key means to change hearts and minds. The idea that we're going to go out and sort of debate our way towards a revolution is unlikely and implausible. And so we actually need to be thinking about what kind of infrastructures we can create with one another to invite people in that will actually create spaces where people's minds can change through their interactions, through the kind of social spheres that we create, through the forms of solidarity and mutual aid that actually create the sort of substrate within which new imaginaries and the radical imagination can grow. And once again, how can we just get better at understanding people? Because ultimately what we're called to do is organize people together to create a new society. And so all of our work, I think, is dedicated to understanding not only how people work, which is of course very interesting, but how people work in movements together and how they don't work and how things fall apart. On the right is just a model that we often use in our workshops that simply points out that there's a balanced relationship in most movements between strategy and trying to figure out a plan to change the world. First, the process of transforming individuals, of actually growing and changing as individuals as we participate in movements. And third, the process of commoning, which is to say the building of alternative structures, the prefigurative politics of building here and now, the sorts of forms of mutual aid and alternative institutions that we need. We use models like this in order to try and invite the people within our workshops to think through how it is that we can actually build the sorts of structures that we need to make the kinds of changes that we very urgently need. That's all a bit abstract and it's all a bit pitchy, but I think we're going to turn now to Sarah, who's going to tell us a little bit, to give us a kind of encapsulation of what we do by talking a little bit about concepts of cognitive dissonance and how they can actually be applied within the context of social movements. I'm also going to share the link to our session in London in November.
Oh yeah, share that. Yeah. Hello everyone. So nice to be here. I'm just going to give a little condensed soundbite about cognitive dissonance. It's one of the things that we get asked about the most. And also I think it's a good example of like kind of our methodology in a way. So that helps people conceptualize what it is we're up to and how you can be involved if you want. Cognitive dissonance theory is one of the oldest kind of standing, functioning cognitive science paradigms. It came right after behaviorism, and it challenged behaviorism, which I can get into over a drink with you sometime if you're really interested in this kind of nerdy thing. But it was discovered amazingly by a group of psychology researchers who got a grant. This used to happen back in the day to infiltrate an alien cult. So they went to some part of the Midwest, and they joined the alien cult. And what they were looking for is what happened when a prediction that the cult made would fail. Because they had read, also, this never happens anymore, but the researchers had actually read a lot of history, and they were looking at cases where apocalyptic cults predicted the apocalypse, and they were fascinated by the way that people often stay in cults after those prophecies fail. So they wanted to understand what actually happens to people psychologically when they believe something incredibly deeply, usually make huge sacrifices for it, and then it seems to be disproven. Like, how do they hold on to beliefs that are kind of measurably false? And why do they remain in that social world a lot of the time? And this is, in fact, more or less what happened in this alien cult. The day where the aliens were supposed to arrive happened. As you probably all know, the world did not end in 1954. And neither was there a massive flood where aliens whisked away only the true believers. So at that point, the members of the cult, first they started looking for what we might call rationalizations for why this wasn't happening yet. So they'd be like, oh, we've got the clock wrong. It'll happen in 5 minutes. And then they had a whole complicated theory about metal. They were like, we're wearing too much metal. The aliens can't put metal in the spaceships. We must remove all metal from our bodies. Um, and eventually, after many different attempted rationalizations, they came to a completely new and rather creative one, which is that they said, we have been such good members of this cult that we have prevented the apocalypse, and this cult is more true now because the prophecy didn't happen. We will now go and spread the word to everyone else. Um, I'm just sharing this because I think it's obviously, hopefully most of you are not in apocalyptic alien cults, but there is always something like slightly resonant about this in left-wing movements, I think. You can kind of see people's like desperation to believe in the social world that they're in and have a coherent system of beliefs and justify those beliefs. It's hard. Basically, it's really hard being a human, even if you're not in an alien cult. Um, so the researchers went and they wrote this up in a fascinating little book here, which you can read and which I encourage you to read. It's amazingly researched. It's somehow still relevant 70 years later. Very relevant. And the theory, although it has gone through revisions in the 70 years since, more or less holds together, which is that people experience discomfort, either conscious or unconscious, when they notice a contradiction between two or more of their beliefs or actions. So believing that the aliens are about to arrive and then not experiencing the aliens arriving. But of course, this can happen in lots of other contexts as well. It can happen when we get on a plane, even though we know planes are destroying the planet. It can happen when we, you know, don't pick an option we want, but instead pick another option because they're not both possible. It turns out people experience a lot of dissonance about choice making. And in the 70 years since this discovery, so to speak, and this theorization of human psychology, there have been many studies um, tracking the very strange and weird behavior that happens when people experience dissonance. So another common way of measuring dissonance is asking people to do things they don't believe in, like even just writing an essay that is contrary to their beliefs, and then watching as they move their beliefs towards the essay they just wrote, especially and often only if they know that essay is going to be read by people in their social world. Why? Because essentially it's very uncomfortable to know you've put forward an idea in the social world you don't agree with, and it's easier to literally change your own actual internal beliefs in a permanent way than it is to live with the discomfort of that dissonance. And we do this all the time, probably. Most people are shaped by the discomfort of any contradictions in their worldview, and they often rationalize in very creative but not especially helpful ways. So one of the places we know dissonance tends to have a profound effect on people's behavior is in religious movements, of course, which are not that dissimilar sometimes from alien cults. We can see it in the way that people are hazed into fraternities. If any of you went through that horrible system in university, that relies heavily on dissonance. But basically, anywhere where we invest a lot of energy and attention and action, we are likely to shape our beliefs towards that. And one of the things I write about in my book is, which I hope you will all read, is that in effect, one of the reasons that like ideas on their own and arguments and discourse can't change our minds is because our minds are already profoundly shaped by two other factors that are much more powerful: our social networks and our social relationships, especially our close ones, but also our more distant ones, and our actions, our everyday actions. And for reasons of cognitive dissonance specifically, we kind of need to match to some degree our beliefs to our daily actions and to our big profound actions in order to live with ourselves and live with our dissonance. So it's very unlikely that a stranger on the street, no matter how good their data is going to shape your mind another way if you're already deeply invested in something else. Max, shall we just go to the next slide so they can see the other dissonance images? Yeah, here you can see the hazing. Um, And another thing that this brings up, of course, is that although I've just described dissonance in a sort of almost like nefarious way, and it can be used for extremely nefarious purposes, there's nothing necessarily liberatory about it, or even knowing how to use it, because right-wing movements could use the same knowledge to do harmful stuff. There are some ways that we can use this as people sort of on the broadly speaking left. We can use this when we think about how we recruit people into social movements. Don't haze them though, but there are other ways you can get people to begin with small actions, and then that often allows them to reshape their views now that they've undertaken a small action, like maybe cycling to work, or just doing one small protest movement can often get people drawn in. There's a lot of really interesting research that I do actually on how much being in protest movements changes people's lives. It does not change, incidentally, the government or the policies of the country statistically at all. It's extremely ineffective at changing the minds of people nearby, but it's very good at changing the people in the movement permanently. So a lot of the research that Max and I look at and think about is about changing not so much people's minds through arguments, but changing them through giving them possibilities to act in the world in a different way, and allowing the mind to change after you try out new ways of living or you engage with new groups of people. That's what I'm really interested in. And I'm also very interested in looking at how we help people recognize the discomfort of dissonance and untangle it for themselves in a way that is hopefully slightly less oppressive, either than being in a right-wing group or being in an alien cult. That's the very, very short version of dissonance theory, but I know that we're going to probably get a bunch of questions about this, so I won't dig super deeply into it. Yeah.
Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about like what works when you notice that somebody is doing a cognitive dissonance? I remember, so I met Sarah, we were in a very ridiculous commune situation, and Sarah was giving a talk on cognitive dissonance, and you said some really interesting things about like, often we notice somebody else is doing a cognitive dissonance, that their actions or that their opinions are contradictory. But if you confront them directly, you're not supposed to confront them directly and be like, you're cognitively dissonant.
Yeah, it's probably not going to work out great for you if you're like, Haiven, you're just deluded. The aliens are not coming. Haiven will not like you for that. Um, and actually, Haiven, in the process of arguing back with you, is probably going to believe his thing more because he hears himself talking and he believes himself reasonably because he is himself. So actually, though, those principles can be reversed, and they have been very successfully reversed in a number of different ways. I mean, just as a caveat, what I'm talking about is still in some ways a minor intervention compared to restructuring someone's social world or their like action possibilities day to day. But there are some ways of having conversations with people that seem to be somewhat more effective at dealing with dissonance. When it comes to and there's basically techniques that are very similar. One is for addiction. And it's called motivational interviewing. Doctors in the UK are actually taught to use this technique now, which is cool. And basically what it does is first it asks the person to give their own evaluation of how important the substance is in their life and like how much it's screwing it up on a scale from 0 to 10. And usually people who are suffering from some kind of addiction are not 100,000% in denial about it. Like they will say, "Oh, I'm at a 2 out of 10 as a problem," because that's realistic, and actually giving them space for that ambivalence is much more effective than confronting them. And then instead of saying, "What do you mean? Like you just drove your car into a tree. You should be at a 10." You ask, "Oh, why are you not at a 0? Like why are you at 2? What problems are you actually facing with this issue?" And then the person has to hear from themselves in their own words reasons why they might actually agree that they have a problem with that substance. And that appears to be quite effective in helping them navigate the dissonance and also elucidate a new way of thinking about it for themselves. So that's one very effective way in the spectrum of interventions that happen through words. Another thing which is similar and is used specifically for political canvassing, especially in America around trans rights and immigration, is something called deep canvassing. As many of you will know, like shallow canvassing, for lack of a better word, normal canvassing. You go to someone's door, you knock on the door, you're like, "Hey, are you voting for Jeremy Corbyn?" And they're like, "No, fuck off, he's an anti-Semite." And then you argue with them about that, and it's super ineffective. Or they're like, "Yes, I am." And then you take down their name and you make sure they show up to vote the day of. Um, that's fine. It turns out that can like help with certain kinds of turnout for very specific issues, but it doesn't really change people's minds, and most normal canvassing does not change anyone's mind in a significant way. Deep canvassing is a longer term technique. You spend at least 30 minutes with a person usually. You do exactly the same thing where you ask them to rate their beliefs on a scale of 0 to 10. You listen to their reasons why they might agree with you. That's what you're asking for, not why they disagree. And then, interestingly, you tell them your own story. And that seems to be very important and make things a lot more effective. So, if you were canvassing for trans rights, you might talk about either yourself if you're trans or another person that's very close to you experiencing discrimination. If you're talking about immigration, similarly. And it turns out that one of the reasons that's very effective is that most people are not going to deny a story. Like if you're like, well, this did happen to me, it's only the most bananas people are going to say like, that didn't happen to you. So it kind of gives them a new fact and almost a sense of a social relationship with a fact that can then be incorporated into their worldview rather than something abstract. And that's quite interesting in terms of all this research on the way people need to shape their beliefs to their social world. And then you ask them to reevaluate their beliefs, and the belief changes are actually quite significant and measurable with deep canvassing, which is remarkable, especially because they're on profoundly political issues, which are the least obvious to change, like the hardest to change. So they're on things like abortion and gay rights, and trans rights and immigration. But yeah, these forms of very long form, open-ended conversation where you're clear about what your views are and you give them stories and you let them experience ambivalence. Like you can do some discourse. It's just really expensive and you have to get trained, right? So one of the things I write about in my book is that these are models for the kind of conversations that we want to engineer in the social world. And I am using that word quite ruthlessly, but engineer in the social world in the sense that we no longer have space for them, even in the informal sense, that we have destroyed the social infrastructure where people would naturally have conversations like that with relative strangers at the pub or at church or at whatever. And we need to rebuild the social infrastructure back that would allow us to make that possible on a daily basis for people. Is that what you had in mind?
That's exactly what I had in mind. And I want to ask one other follow-up question just
Yeah,
to
please.
round it out, which is like, I think one of the things that you've explained to me, and I think is really valuable, is that it's not, and I think what's really unique about your work and what you bring to our collaboration is that it's not enough just to read the cognitive science literature. You also bring in this longer history of critiques of ideology and like this critical theory. So at Sense and Solidarity, we sort of bring three things together. We bring together this like data and analysis from cognitive science. We bring together like stuff from this body of literature called critical theory, which is the way that anti-capitalists and critical thinkers have been thinking about power for the last 100 years. And we also bring together insights from social movements. But I just want you to maybe say briefly why the concept of ideology is so important and how it helps supplement some of these ideas from cognitive sciences.
Yes, thank you for framing my research so well also. I think, I'm now going to very, very gently take a stab at a critique of a lot of people who write about the same issues on the left, which is that in general, there have been roughly two-ish approaches to the question of ideology on the left. One of them has been to say, this is condescending. Don't ever say that people who are oppressed don't know it. And, there is, I want to say, value to that critique. There are many people who are oppressed and they know it just fine. They're just stuck. So it's not that everyone who experiences oppression cannot identify it. However, there are also many instances where people are oppressed and are, at some sense, at least drawn into and even sort of attached to in some way or motivated by their own oppression. There are, historically, so many women deeply invested in the patriarchy. There are people who are profoundly caught up in all kinds of weird ways with the labor they do for other people's profit. We could go on and on and on. So I think, while I accept the critique that many people know they're oppressed, there is still work to be done trying to understand why people often, as Wilhelm Reich used to say, fight as passionately for their own oppression as they would their salvation, their liberation. And the second answer has been to say, yes, there is ideology. It does oppress people. People do end up fighting for their own oppression in some way. They, I don't know, foot bind their children. They do all kinds of horrific stuff that is actually bad for them. And we're going to explain this using Freud. And then, to be honest, like in the left, most of the psychology that has been thrown at that problem has been Freudian. And I actually love Freud, and I am so happy to do Freud reading groups. And I think there's lots of interesting stuff in Freud. I also think there's lots of problematic and dumb stuff and some stuff that's just wrong. But, fine, Freud is lovely. Freud also died 100 years ago. And since then, we have done a lot of admittedly quite liberal facing scientific research on how people respond to their own oppression, however indirectly, and that research matters and has been completely neglected. It's very rare, with a couple of names that I could probably list on one sheet of paper, that researchers or theorists look at other kinds of psychological research to explain why people behave the way they do. Oh yeah, Ivan is linking my little favorite quote ever. So to go back to this question of ideology, I think there's interesting stuff to say about how people often do know they're oppressed, and there's interesting stuff to say about Freud, and I'm very happy to talk about both of those things, but I want to bring this third thing more prominently to our thinking, and in particular to people who are actually on the ground. Because in truth, although it's nice to write fancy books for fancy publishers, it's not really the point of being alive. The point of being alive is to go solve some problems for real people in the world. And there are tools at our disposal through lenses of cognitive science, neuroscience, etc., that we can use, however imperfect they may be, that are perhaps a little bit neglected. So I'm trying to build up kind of a library of tools for people to fight ideology, let's say, in the 21st century with some of the scientific research that has only ever really been used for some like kind of liberalish reasons at best.
Maybe we should turn it over to the discussion in a minute. I just want to make a plug for, we just booked this. Our next intensive workshop is November 14th through 17th in London, England. Not the incredibly boring London, Canada, which you
Yeah,
should
don't go
check out.
there.
Don't go there.
All of Max's anecdotes are about Canada, and he'll be like, in Canada, we were fighting the police when this thing happened. But don't go to there. It's boring.
Some of the anecdotes are even good. Yeah.
Your anecdotes are good. You're just always like, here's a really interesting thing that happened in Canada, but also don't go to that part of Canada. It's boring.
Yeah. They don't involve like things like wrestling bears or anything that
No,
salacious.
just
Yeah.
fascist. Yeah.
Just fascists and cops. But we, the URL is at the bottom. It's senseandsolidarity.org. And just maybe to wrap it up quickly, I would say that one of the places where Sarah's work and my work comes together is we both are very firm believers that people's minds change when they do stuff together. They don't change when they think different thoughts. So a lot of what we focus on in our workshops and our research is how is it that we can get people actually doing stuff, building stuff, fighting together, and taking actions together that change the way we think? Because often what we think is a justification of what we do rather than what we think leading to what we do, in some sense. But maybe we should open it up for discussion.
I would just say thank you both massively for these dense charged electric inputs. Finishing thought of Max reminded me also of the research of Miles Hugstone, who did basically research between Protestants and Catholics in Ireland, and how the social relation gap was bridged by doing things together. This doing things together was really important. Segregation that was kind of created by apartheid culture over there as well meant that people were slowly in communal spaces, but they were still a bit ghettoized even within like the same space. And when they actually started doing things together, which came through schooling and mixed schools, where you actually had to work on projects together, that started developing social relations. And I think he calls it the contact hypothesis. And I'm going to put a link to the Wikipedia page, Miles being the most British.
That's in my book. You should. The contact hypothesis is super important, but that's a great individual piece of research on it. It's like,
thank you so much. We're gonna let you know what the next deeper inquiry is. I'm gonna stop recording here.